very happy to say that we're a non-profit organization that is dedicated to trying to get parish councils and town councils and community organizations uh, more effectively on the road towards climate change or just in the environment generally. So we run a weekly banter session, which Linda is now the host for the 100th session, which is sort of good news. Yes, ta-da. And we try to bring up a useful topic every week, which sort of is about 15 to 25 minutes for chatting, and then the rest of the time is spent in answering questions. People put all sorts of helpful links in the chat because we produce the whole lot afterwards on our knowledge base, and you'll all get a copy of the notifications to where that is and when it's gone up. And that is building into some place where people can come as their first port of call, I hope, when they're looking to do anything in the climate change or net zero worlds. So rather than get confused by the multiplicity of details out on the internet, we're trying to find best practice in any field or arena and point people towards it.
Brilliant.
And the chats that we give each Wednesday are a major part of the knowledge base. So thank you very much for the time, Linda. All yours.
Great. Session is being recorded, which was going to go into the knowledge base. Hopefully that's okay with everybody. Well, there will be some breakout groups, so I'm going to, that won't be recorded then. So today is going to be a bit different, perhaps from a normal banter, in that I'm going to invite everybody, if they can and are able to switch their mobile phones off and to give attention, because we're going to be looking at the subject of attention and why it's so helpful. So we're going to be looking at that, and there's going to be chance to go into breakouts. And whilst we're not necessarily sharing anything personal, if you do share anything personal in the breakout, it would be nice to agree that the person you're with doesn't come back and say, you won't believe what they've just said, or similar. If you want to share your own personal stuff, you can. So that would just be nice to know that it's confidential. A bit of background really about me. I'm an organization development consultant and coach and facilitator involved in climate for the last 8 years, particularly, and now a climate psychologist. And I'm a qualified psychotherapeutic counselor, amongst other things. And back in 2008, I came across an organization called Time to Think. And I was a coach and also an assessor of coaches at the time and teaching coaches. And it really struck me that this was something very, very important, is how do we have time to think and how do we create conditions where people really can think? Because often lots of coach training and lots of counselling training actually teaches you to interrupt, teaches you how to interrupt effectively or ineffectively. And so this was very different. So this really grabbed me. So I'm going to invite you to give attention today for this next hour, if you can, and switch off any things that are going to ping and close your email down to just think about this. The reason I think it's so important, I hope will transpire. I've got some slides to share with you around some of the concepts of it. The first part of it came from this book called Time to Think by a lady called Nancy Klein. And Nancy is an American living in Oxfordshire. And I met Nancy, as I said, back in 2008, and I trained with her as something called a thinking partnership practitioner. Hello, Amanda. Nice to see you. I'm trained as a thinking partnership practitioner, and I went on to train more and more and more, and eventually became faculty member of Time to Think. There are just 35 of us around the world, and we teach and qualify people to work with what we call the thinking environment. So that's what I'm going to do today, is invite you in. And Amanda, we just agreed that when we go into breakouts and then come back and reflect, that anything personal that's shared in the breakout pairs doesn't get shared. That's just lovely. And invited also people to switch off devices and focus on the quality of the attention they're giving right now. And we'll look at why that is so important. So I'm going to start with some slides, and everything is invitational. You don't have to do anything. If you say, I don't want to go into a breakout, that's fine too. And these ideas are used all over the world now. Quite a lot in NHS. So a lot of NHS organisations create what we call thinking environments. Lots of councils, I've worked with loads of those, lots of corporates, lots of coaches and facilitators use these practices. So let's share. And the session I usually call is Think Well, Think Together. And we've done that in the chat. What brings you here today? So there's been a mixture of curiosity. My post on LinkedIn, people already know each other. And so a variety of different things. So this is what we call the 10 components of the thinking environment. We're going to look at a few of them today. I will share. I'll share these. You'll see this on the recording afterwards, and I'll also put links into various sources of information, including websites. And I will come back to that. The beautiful thing about the thinking environment is, although there are 10 things, unless you're actually teaching it, you don't need to remember all 10. You can begin to apply them every day in your life. How did this come about? Well, the first one is what I've just said, it's attention. And we'll talk a bit about what we call it a component, but it's an element of creating a space in which people can think well. And we define attention and thinking environment as listening without interruption and with interest in where the person will go next in their thinking. So what's this all about? What's the background to this? Well, the thinking environment started with a key observation by Nancy Klein back at least 40, 50 years ago now, around 40, 50 years ago. She's still alive and teaching occasionally. And it started with this key observation that the quality of everything we do depends on the quality of the thinking we do first. If we don't have good thinking, we won't make good decisions and we won't take good actions and we won't get good outcomes. But in this day and age of everybody so busy all the time, our attention's being grabbed by multiple sources, multiple factors, both internal and external. We're not often getting the quality of the thinking time that we really need. Good thinking results in good decisions and good actions. If we want good outcomes, we have to have quality thinking. And so this many years ago set Nancy off on a quest. She's a leadership trainer, and anybody here who's a Quaker might recognize some of the practices that we use. It's not a spiritual or religious organization or way of being, but it is based on ways of being together that help people to think and share and open up and create. So you'll recognize the elements of Quaker practice in here. But we don't sell it as that. It's not about that. It's about the quality of thinking. And what we've been finding over the years, Nancy started out on her own, and then a few of us joined her and started to look at this singular question that obsessed us really, particularly Nancy in the early days, is what does it take for people to think well for themselves? And what she'd noticed was in the schools that she'd taught in, and the colleges and the leadership institutions, and the coaching and the management courses, very little was focused on what is it to think well and how do you do that well? How do you think well? And what she noticed principally is that if you didn't get the right kind of attention, if you didn't get attention when you were thinking, when you were with others, you wouldn't think very well because it would have an impact on your brain and on your thinking patterns itself, that you were being interrupted or you weren't being attended to. Now, what we now know, which we didn't know 40 years ago, is that actually there's a neurobiological element to this. If you give somebody attention, they feel safe, if it's the right kind of attention. And they'll feel safe to be creative, to explore, to think for themselves as themselves. And the findings along the way have been things like the way that we behave as listeners with people actually has more impact on the quality of their thinking than their IQ, their prior knowledge, or their experience. Doesn't mean to say their thinking is going to be the same as a rocket scientist, but if you are someone who's not a rocket scientist, what they thought about landing people on the moon, they would have some thoughts. They might not be technical, they might not be based on experience, they might not have particular intellectual expertise, to think about that, but they can think about the subject and they can share their thoughts with you. So the way we behave with people has a big impact. We're actually helping them as co-creators in their thinking because, as you'll know from your climate work and your biodiversity work, we are all connected. We are all connected to everything. So the way we behave with people has much more impact on the quality of their thinking than their IQ, prior knowledge, or experience. We also have discovered along the way that the human mind seems to think better in the presence of a question. And yet, how often do we go to meetings with lists of things that we've got to cover? And the energy changes when you say, here's a list of questions we need to address today. What we've also found is that the mind who's got a question with the question is usually the best one to answer it. And if you've had the luck of having a great coach in your life, you will know that when you ask the coach a question, often they will say, that's a great question. What are your thoughts about that? And something amazing happens. And you go, oh, yeah, well, they're interested in what I think. Oh, what do I think? And off they go. And if I'm in a group, if I'm teaching to a group in an audience, by the way, you can interrupt me at any time and put your hand up if I'm going too fast. So do feel free to do that, even though I've said it's not about interruptions. But I'd appreciate it, no chat at the moment, because that will pop up and take our attention away. Our brains, as Oliver Burkeman has told us in some of his wonderful books, particularly one called Oliver Burkeman is Busy, is that we can't do two things at once. We think we can. There's no such thing as multitasking. We're task switching. And it takes 40% longer when you task switch to get your thinking back to where it was before you went somewhere else. So we know that the mind with a question is usually the best one to answer it. So if I'm in a group of a live audience and somebody asks a question about the thinking environment, they'll say things like, this sounds great, but it'll never work in my organization because of so-and-so. How would I do that in my organization? And I say, that's an interesting thought. What are your first thoughts? And they'll, guess what they'll do? They'll answer it. And they say, well, I could try this and I could try that. And I say, yeah, absolutely you could. So we know that the mind with a question is often the best one to answer it. And I'd say 99% of the time. And anyone that's been coached by me will notice that I don't speak at all. Unlike many coaches which do speak. I can speak if you invite me to, but most of the time we find that you do the work in your own space because I've given you time to think. We've also noticed that the mind seems to think in waves and pauses. So someone will have a thought and maybe they'll share that verbally and they'll go quiet. And if we don't interrupt that quiet, because we recognize they're probably still busy thinking, they will have some more thoughts about it, whatever that question is. But in society, we tend to always interpret a pause as a chance to nip in there ourselves. And in fact, one could say we live in two worlds of thinking. There's a large, large world, which we could call exchange thinking, where there's an unwritten rule that when someone speaks, somebody else speaks immediately afterwards, or sometimes before they finished. And we know that that's a big world we're used to. It's a dialogue world. We can have a chat, we can have a banter, there's an exchange. And that's it's a great place to be. But it's often coming at the expense of the much smaller and increasingly smaller world of independent thinking. What do I think about this for myself, as myself? What's my view here? I'm fed all this information. What do I think about this? What's right for me? What are my values? What's a decision that feels good to me that's not influenced overly by somebody else's? So we've noticed when we don't always just jump straight in and we let that pause happen, the person will continue thinking for themselves. Now, naturally, we have to have some agreements around this. Otherwise, some people could talk forever and a day. So we have some agreements around taking turns and things like that. Because knowing you will have a turn is very different from being lucky in getting one. Have you ever been to a meeting where you've never spoken the whole time, or you've noticed somebody else hasn't? And how quiet, and often managers and leaders say to me, I just wish everybody would, play their part in a meeting. And my question to them is often, well, what are the conditions you're setting up to make that possible for people to step in and speak? How safe is it? Are you making it explicit that everybody can speak if they want to, that we can go round and have a turn? And as long as we manage the time well, everyone can speak if they want to. And anyone that knows the work of the Google Aristotle project a few years ago, which looked at high-performing teams. Now, of course, not every organization is like Google, thank goodness. However, we do know that the research they did of vast numbers of teams, vast amounts of research data, is that there were 5 things that made teams really effective. And the top factor that made teams the most effective and high-performing was the extent to which they created psychological safety. And psychological safety means that you know you have various things, such as it's safe to speak, or you perceive it's safe to speak. You perceive that you won't get criticized. You perceive that you can get something wrong and not get laughed at. So certain things that make it safe for you to take risks and be creative. And part of what the practices of these high-performing teams was making sure that everybody had a turn to speak at the beginning and at the end of meetings. And it was not necessarily with a hand timer, but it was time, we've each got a meeting to speak here. Haven't had time today, hence the chat. So knowing you'll have a turn is very different from being lucky and just getting one because you've been able to get in. So we then come on to these 10 components, and there are 10 behaviors that seem to make a significant difference in the quality of our thinking. And you don't need to remember all of them, but if all you'd remembered was the quality of your attention makes a massive difference. When someone else is speaking, that will change the way they think. Because when one person gets attention and someone else or others listen with the intention of igniting their thinking as if they're on a shared creative journey, they listen to ignite and not to respond, we think better. And it is also natural that when someone's talking, we are always in the background thinking what we want to say in response to it, either to make a comment or a joke or a suggestion or an observation. But when we change our perspective and we intentionally listen to ignite their thinking and not just to respond to it, they think better. They just do. When you know you're not going to get interrupted, I mean, you know for sure you're not going to get interrupted, you'll just develop so much more confidence in your own thoughts. Whereas if you're waiting, just imagine what's happening to your amygdala, to your nervous system, when you're waiting for someone to nip in there and have a joke at your expense. And Ovid, the great philosopher, knew this, and there's very rarely a management program without a dead Greek philosopher popping up occasionally. And Ovid, in whatever year it was, 439 BC, AD, I don't know, I should know the year. He said, an idea is a very delicate thing. It can be killed by a frown on the right man's brow or a sneer on the right man's face. So he knew the power of someone else's response to our thinking that could kill the idea. I'll just do a couple more of these and then we'll move on. So when we give attention to somebody rather than interrupting them, it actually seems to have the effect of asking them a question. When we just give attention and we wait expectantly, wonder what else this person thinks, this is really interesting, where are they going? It has the effect of asking, what more do you think or feel or want to say? And it starts a new wave of thinking. And people sometimes say, well, that's all very well, Linda, all this independent thinking. We want people to work together. But what we found is that when independent thinking is welcomed and you're given a turn and your ideas are listened to and you feel respected and valued, guess what you do? You listen to others better, you become more collaborative, you become less triggered, less emotionally dysregulated. And of course, this is all going on beneath the surface in most corporate boardrooms, most meetings every day. We go to work terrified. Well, most people go to work every day with a hope they don't even know they have, which is that somebody's going to ask them what they think. But equally, at the same time, we go to work with an absolute terror because someone's going to say, what do you think? Because if they say it in a way that puts the pressure on us, they're going to go, I don't know. What do I think? I don't know. I don't want to get it wrong. So if we create conditions in which people can think, well, we'll all think better and more collaboratively. So I'll stop there for a moment and just see, let's get people's responses to what I've just said. Any questions, challenges, observations? Andrew?
I've got an interesting one. So if the Google Aristotle project was such a success, how come Google, by, I don't know, some metrics, is probably, obviously they did drop its "don't be evil" thing, and people would now kind of associate Google with AI and kind of thinking that may not be ideal by, again, some metrics. I'm wondering how you hold these two kind of almost like different things in the same space.
Yeah. What they were looking at specifically was team effectiveness, not strategic effectiveness. I think. Yeah. And the research was done, I think it was about 2015, something like that. Well, certainly before COVID. But yeah, so these behaviors, these were repeated across team after team. If there was psychological safety, they were more creative, more connected, more trusting, more likely to take risks, but measured risks. Anything else? Any other thoughts, questions, challenges?
Just an observation, Linda, that I used to start my career, or I started my career in the Royal Navy, and it was very noticeable that some ships or submarines were much more effective than others. And the ones that were happy ships were because everybody felt part of a team. And the more familial, if that's the right word, the atmosphere, then the more everybody worked together. And the more that they worked together, the much better they were at responding to an emergency. So what you're saying is so far hitting all the right spots as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, there's some Amanda.
I'm so sorry that you probably said before I joined about not putting anything in the chat. So I did put something in the chat, which probably did disturb, but was just comparing with that part of my career that I spent in the classroom teaching. And first of all, that fear of being asked, probably, I'm seeing where this has come from because we've all been to school. That's the one thing that we've all had to do, if you like, in our upbringing, and also the fact that it's when I said essential classroom practice, what I meant by that was vital or the core of classroom practice. I didn't mean the basics of teaching practice because it's something that you work on. You first of all think it's about controlling your class for class behavior. But actually, it's about enabling your class when you truly mature as a teacher and getting your students so inspired that they'll get more from it, that they believe in it for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Beautifully put. I didn't get a chance to read the message because I was talking, but yeah, beautifully put.
I was referring to Alistair Smith, who, when I was learning, probably about 20 years ago, was the guru on accelerated learning. That's what he
Okay.
called it.
All right,
And
thank you. We'll look up.
it's
Yeah.
all about the brain connection. If the more we understand about the brain and how it works, the better we can develop and learn and thrive.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
so what we know is that what we found over the years is there is a neurobiological link to this, is if you feel psychologically safe, you are much more likely to be tapping into if you're feeling alarmed, for example, and bearing in mind that an idea is a very delicate thing, it can be killed by a frown on the wrong man's brow, on the right man's brow, is if you're feeling safe, then or unsafe, your Broca's area in your brain responsible for language will shut down. Just shut down. You know what it's like when someone puts you at the classroom, teacher puts you on the spot and says, "What do you think, Freddie?" You go, "Ah." Your language, you can't find the words. It's because you're been triggered in that area. We know that when you create safety and you say, "I'm going to give you attention and I'm going to listen to what you say," and of course that can be learned. We used to be able to do it and we've unlearned it because of the pace of life. So these are these components, and there's so much in this, and I'm going to try and squeeze as much in as I can today in an easeful way. We know that, or we say we know, our observations over hundreds and hundreds of coaching sessions, of meetings, of events and conferences, is that the quality of the attention is absolutely key. When we give attention and when we receive attention, it changes the outcome into something much more positive. So I'm going to go back to my slides. So so how do you make this come alive? When we're going to talk about some of the components in a moment, but how do we make this come alive? Well, the thinking environment is this. It's the book was called Time to Think, but the process and those 10 components, which I will go back to shortly, enable us to actually build a thinking environment in pieces. And it doesn't mean that you have to do the whole thing. You can use little building blocks, as long as you apply the components within there. And I'll come back to what the components are. So these are little things you can use in your meetings. Thinking pairs. You can invite people into pairs. Lots of people are not very comfortable in large groups, and so they shut down. They are either not confident in speaking, or it's just their preference, you know. Whereas we know that when you create safety and you put people into pairs, generally they will think better together and they'll be able to give each other better attention. So we use it in pairs. So if you're in a meeting and the meeting feels like it's stalling and people just aren't coming to life, give them a lovely question and send them into pairs and ask them to have a think about it. And then come back to the main group and share their thinking. And you'll find immediate acceleration in contribution. Dialogue is a bit like a thinking pair. We're going to do a thinking pair in a moment. I'll come back to that. Rounds, starting and ending meetings with rounds, using rounds to harvest data, making sure that people know they've got a turn if they want one, but asking them to be succinct when they have a turn, because one of the components of a thinking environment is equality. If we feel equal as thinkers, even if there's a hierarchy of pecking order, status, income, job title, you name it, if we know that each person in the room is there for a reason and they have an equal chance to contribute, that will change the energy. And one of the things I say to leaders when I work with them is you need to work really hard not to be the first to always speak in a round. You know, it's really helpful when a leader does not be the first. And open discussion, which is a free-flowing discussion without the rigor of the round, but with a promise of no interruption. So I'm going to invite you to do a thinking pair. And this is 5 minutes each way. You've probably done all these kinds of things before in other groups, a listening exercise. And it's not a conversation. It's where you each have a period of time to think about a question together. And the agreement we ask you to do is that the thinking partner, which is the one doing the listening, agrees to listen expectantly, promises not to interrupt, and if you feel comfortable, to keep your eyes on the eyes of the person doing the thinking. Not everyone will, but we certainly know that when you know you've got attention, provided it's with a good intention, and you know you've got that person's attention, we will think better. There's a biological reason for attention. It's because we are humans. We need attention to survive. If we were just left as babies after we've been born on our own to fend for ourselves in the jungle, we wouldn't last long. But attention is a biological mechanism that persists through life. So there's two roles in a thinking pair. There's the thinking partner, the listener, also known as the listener. And your role is to listen with interest, fascination in what the person's saying and what they might say next. Because you don't know what they're going to say next, and they don't know either. And neither of you will know if you interrupt it. And be aware that you can interrupt it with a frown, or a laugh, or a sneer, or a quick movement, or a look at your watch. Any of those things, the brain will receive as a danger signal. This person isn't interested anymore. I'm talking rubbish about changing the subject. You know, that kind of thing goes on. So that's the invitation, and it's only 5 minutes. When I coach, I do this for an hour and a half. So it's a muscle that could be stretched. The thinker is invited to think, and they can think quietly or out loud. Most people think out loud when they're with someone else. And what we do is say to them, you can think about this freely, knowing you won't be interrupted, because that's the deal. You're not going to be interrupted. And the person's just going to listen and give you their attention, and you can think about this. And even if you go quiet when you're thinking, your thinking partner, your listener, is not going to nip in, make a comment, or make it and turn it into a conversation. It's purely a 5 minute for you, and it's going to be 5 minutes for them. So this is the question to think about, is what happens to your thinking when you get interrupted in a conversation? So each have 5 minutes on that. So person A goes first, and then person B goes. And in between, because we're short on time today, we don't have time for a dialogue in between, but we'll come back and do a round. So what happens to your thinking when you get interrupted in a conversation? Now, what can typically happen is one person starts talking and thinking, and they dry up a bit, often because we're not used to somebody just listening to us. And they go, oh, I don't know, I think that's all I want to say. Then what you can do is just ask them, what more do you think or feel or want to say? Because it shows that you're still interested, and it's one of the components, it's encouragement. Encourage means to give courage to. So you're going to give courage to their thinking. And then you swap round. And then you end with an appreciation, which is another of the components. Appreciation of a quality that you've observed in the other. Not what they've done, not, oh, I really like what you've said you're going to do, I really like that. A quality, the kind of thing you might say when someone says, what's Fred like? You say, well, yeah, Fred's a guy, nice guy, if he's got a good sense of humour. Fred's this, Fred's that. So not what they've done. So then, and what we'll do is put a let's say a 12-minute pair together, 11-minute pair actually, because I have 5 each way. I'll let you know when to swap round, and then I'll let you know when the second 5 is finished, and then you have a minute to give each other an appreciation of a quality you've observed in the other. When we come back, we're just going to reflect on what that was like. So what happens to your thinking when you get interrupted in a conversation? And if they need a bit of help, they can usually ask for it and say, well, I'm dried up, I'm stuck, I'm done. Just ask them, what more do you think or feel or want to say? And we've tested these questions over the years. What more do you think or feel or want to say? Does anybody not want to take part in a thinking pair?
Linda, I'm happy to if the numbers work out, but I'm suffering quite a bit at the minute.
Okay, thanks,
I'm happy
Anna.
to if it makes up the pairs though.
Great, thank you. Let's have a look at the breakout. So